I rented the cabin because I wanted silence, not comfort. It sat deep in a stretch of state land that used to be logged decades ago. A place where the roads narrowed into gravel and then into dirt that barely counted as a road at all. The listing said it was off-grid but sturdy, good for riding, good for clearing your head. That was exactly what I wanted. I had just come off a long stretch of night shifts, my sleep wrecked, my nerves thin. I wanted a place where nothing could reach me. The drive in took longer than expected. The GPS stopped working about 20 minutes before I arrived, and the directions I had printed felt vague in a way that made my stomach tighten. I passed no other cars, no houses, just bare trees, fallen branches, and snow that had melted and refrozen into gray ice along the edges of the road. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than the photos, hunched under the trees like it had grown there by accident. The cabin was old but not falling apart. The porch sagged a little in the middle. The front door stuck when I pushed it open, scraping against the frame. Inside, it smelled like cold wood and dust. No mold, no rot, just that dry, unused smell of a place that waits. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, a couch with a thin blanket folded over the back, and a wood stove against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was clean in a basic way, like someone had wiped surfaces but not lived there. I unloaded my things and locked the door. The lock was old, a simple deadbolt that slid into place with a dull metal sound. I remember thinking it would keep animals out, not people. I brushed the thought away. Nobody had any reason to come out here. The first night was quiet in a way that felt heavy. The wind moved through the trees, slow and steady, making branches rub against each other. I cooked a simple meal and ate it standing at the counter, listening to the stove crackle. I slept hard, the kind of sleep that feels like dropping into a hole. The second day passed without anything strange. I walked the short trail behind the cabin, noticed old tire ruts half buried in leaves, probably from maintenance trucks years ago. I came back before dark and bolted the door out of habit. That night, I woke up around 3 in the morning for no clear reason. The cabin was silent. The stove had gone cold. I lay there listening, waiting for my heart to slow. After a while, I convinced myself it was just my body adjusting to the quiet. The next morning, I noticed the porch chair had moved. It was a heavy wooden chair, the kind that takes effort to drag. When I arrived, it had been pushed against the wall. Now it sat closer to the steps, angled toward the door. I told myself the wind had shifted it, even though I knew the ground was uneven and the chair had not moved before. Later that day, I found footprints near the side of the cabin. The ground was soft where snowmelt had soaked into the dirt. The prints were clear enough to see the tread, deep at the heel. They were not animal prints. They were boot prints, leading from the trees toward the back of the cabin, then stopping. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them, trying to line them up with my own boots. They did not match. That night, I triple-checked the locks. I pushed the table slightly in front of the door, not enough to block it, just enough that I would hear it scrape if someone tried to open it. I slept lightly, waking at every sound. Sometime before dawn, I heard movement outside. Not footsteps on the porch, but something brushing along the wall, slow and careful. The sound stopped when I held my breath. I stayed still for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling my pulse in my ears. Nothing else happened. When morning came, the sky was gray and low. I found fresh footprints circling the cabin. They went to the windows. One set stopped beneath the bedroom window, the ground pressed flat where someone had stood there for a while. I did not see any marks on the glass, but the feeling that came over me was heavy and cold. This was not someone passing through. This was someone watching. I considered leaving right then. I should have. Instead, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hiker had come too close. Maybe someone else had rented nearby land. I packed my bag anyway, just in case, and kept my keys in my pocket. That afternoon, I noticed something inside the cabin was different. One of the kitchen drawers was open. I knew I had closed it. Inside, my knife was no longer where I had placed it. I searched every surface, every drawer, every shelf. It was gone. I stood there, the realization sinking in slowly, my skin prickling. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I did not stay calm after that. I moved through the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing else was missing. No signs of forced entry. The door was still locked. The windows were intact. That was worse in a way. It meant whoever came in knew how to get inside. I waited until there was enough light left to drive. As I stepped onto the porch with my bag, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Just a shape, tall and still, partly hidden by branches. I froze. The shape did not move. It did not need to. The message was clear enough. I backed into the cabin and shut the door, sliding the deadbolt into place with shaking hands. I stayed there as the light faded, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, listening. Hours passed. The sounds outside came and went. Leaves crunching, slow steps, weight shifting. Near midnight, something heavy leaned against the door. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to test it. The table scraped softly across the floor. I stayed silent, every muscle locked. After a long time, the pressure eased. The steps moved away. I did not sleep. When dawn finally came, I left. I did not pack carefully. I did not clean. I unlocked the door and walked straight to my car, not looking anywhere else. The forest felt closer than before. The trees pressed in, watching. The drive out was faster, reckless. When I reached the main road, my hands were numb from gripping the wheel. I reported what happened later, from a safe place with people around. I do not know who was out there or why they chose that cabin. I know this. The cabin was not empty. It never had been. It was a place someone used, a place they felt entitled to. I did not belong there, and they made sure I understood that. I will never rent a place that far from people again. I do not look for silence anymore. Silence is where someone can stand just outside the light and wait. I stayed at the cabin because it was cheap and because no one else wanted it that time of year. Late November had already pushed most people out of the mountains. The listing warned about snow, poor cell service, and wildlife. It didn't mention anything about people, which I assumed meant there were none around. That was what I wanted. I had just ended a long stretch of work where every day felt crowded and loud. I needed space. I needed quiet. I needed a place where nothing would expect anything from me. The cabin sat at the end of a logging road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The drive-in took longer than planned because snow had melted and refrozen, turning parts of the road into hard ruts of ice. Branches scraped along the sides of my car. When I finally reached the clearing, the light was already fading. The cabin stood alone near the treeline, dark wood against white ground, smoke stains around the chimney like old scars. It was a hunter's cabin. One room, no electricity, no running water. A wood stove, a narrow bed, a table nailed to the floor. The door was thick and heavy, with a metal latch that looked newer than the rest of the place. Inside, the air was dry and cold, with the smell of old smoke and damp boots that never fully dried. I unloaded my gear, locked the door, and started a fire. As the stove warmed, the walls popped and shifted. Felt normal, settling sounds. Nothing more. That first night was quiet but uneasy. The wind moved through the trees in long waves, pushing snow off branches in soft collapses. I slept lightly, waking whenever the fire cracked or the roof creaked under shifting snow. Still, nothing happened. Morning came gray and heavy, clouds low enough to feel close. I spent the day splitting wood and walking short distances around the cabin. I noticed old signs of use. Rusted nails hammered into trees. A half-buried fire pit filled with ash and bone fragments. Someone had been here often at some point. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was how fresh some of it looked. A log recently cut. Boot prints half filled with snow but not frozen solid yet. I told myself it could have been from the last renter. Or a ranger. Or a hunter passing through. I went back inside before dark and locked the door again. That night, the wind died completely. The silence felt heavier without it. No movement, no distant sound, just the slow tick of the stove cooling as the fire burned down. I woke up sometime after midnight with the feeling that something had changed. The air felt wrong, like pressure before a storm. I heard footsteps outside. Not animals. Not the scattered sound of something moving fast. These were slow, even steps crunching snow. They stopped near the side of the cabin, close enough that I could hear the snow compress fully underweight. I stayed still, listening. The steps moved again, circling, stopping now and then. Someone walked the length of the walls. The steps stopped near the door. I sat upright in bed, barely breathing. The latch did not move. There was no knock, just stillness. After a long time, the steps moved away, fading toward the trees. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, the tracks were clear. One set of boot prints, deep and wide, circling the cabin twice. They stopped near every window. One set stood directly in front of the door for a long time. I could tell by how deep the snow was pressed down. I packed some of my things then, just in case. I told myself I would leave if it happened again. The weather forecast I had downloaded before losing service mentioned heavy snow coming in the next 2 days. Leaving immediately meant driving through ice again, but staying suddenly felt worse. That afternoon, I found something near the woodpile. A cigarette, but crushed into the snow. I didn't smoke. It hadn't been there the day before. The paper was still mostly white, not soaked through. Recent. That night, the storm came early. Snow fell thick and steady, muting every sound. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I kept the fire going, feeding it slowly. The storm should have made me feel safer. Didn't. The footsteps returned. This time, they didn't circle. They approached directly. Snow crunched hard near the door. Something brushed against the wall. Then pressure. Not enough to break anything. Just someone leaning against the cabin, testing it. The latch rattled once, lightly, then again. I sat on the floor with my back against the far wall, holding a flashlight that I didn't turn on. I focused on breathing slowly, quietly. Minutes passed, maybe more. Eventually, the pressure eased. The steps moved away, slower than before, dragging slightly. I didn't follow them. I didn't look outside. I stayed there until morning. When daylight came, the storm had buried everything. The tracks were gone. The road was completely covered. My car sat half buried in snow. Leaving now would have meant digging for hours and then risking getting stuck miles from anywhere. I was trapped by weather, whether I liked it or not. I stayed inside all day, feeding the fire, listening. Late in the afternoon, I heard something from the back of the cabin. A dull thud, then another, like something heavy being set down. I did not investigate. I stayed where I was, eyes fixed on the door. That night was worse. The steps returned closer, heavier. Snow fell from the roof as someone brushed past the walls. Something scraped along the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate. At one point, I heard metal lightly tap against wood, near the latch. Not forceful, careful. I don't know how long it went on. Eventually, it stopped. The silence after felt unreal. In the morning, I found what had made the thud. A stack of firewood placed against the back wall. Neat, intentional, as if someone had been helping or planning. That was when I knew this wasn't random. Someone knew this cabin, knew the storms, knew when people would be isolated. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. The storm broke the next day. I dug out my car until my hands were numb and bleeding. I didn't bother fixing the cabin or cleaning anything. I left the door locked and drove out as soon as the road allowed it. Later, I learned the truth from a local report I found online. That stretch of forest had a history of illegal winter trapping and long-term squatting. People who stayed off the grid, who used old structures when needed. The cabin was known. Locals avoided it. No one had been trying to scare me for fun. No one wanted attention. They just wanted me gone. I don't think about that place because of fear alone. I think about how quiet it all was, how patient, how controlled. Whoever was out there never rushed, never made a mistake. They waited, knowing the land would do most of the work for them. I don't go to places like that anymore. I don't trust cheap listings in remote areas. And when I hear snow falling at night, heavy and soft, I remember how easy it was to be surrounded and never see a single face. I booked the cabin in late October, right before the weather fully turned. It was meant to be a quiet reset, a few days away from screens, noise, and people. The cabin was listed as seasonal, used mostly by hunters earlier in the fall and empty the rest of the year. It sat at the edge of a national forest, far enough off the main road that the drive-in took nearly an hour after the last gas station. I remember thinking that once I arrived, nothing would interrupt me. That idea felt comforting at the time. The road narrowed the farther I drove. Pavement turned into gravel, then into packed dirt with deep grooves from old tires. The trees grew thicker and taller, blocking most of the sky. I didn't see any other cars, not even tire tracks that looked recent. When I finally reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The cabin was smaller than expected. One floor, weathered with siding, a metal roof spotted with rust. There was no fence, no nearby structures, just trees in every direction. A woodpile sat near the side wall, half covered with a torn tarp. The windows were narrow and placed high, like the place was built more for function than comfort. Inside, it was cold and dry. The air smelled like old wood and dust, with a faint hint of something sour, maybe from animals getting inside at some point. The furniture was basic and heavy. A table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a couch with thin cushions, and a small bed in the corner separated by a half wall. There were no decorations, no personal items, nothing that suggested anyone stayed there often. I locked the door after bringing my things inside. The lock was stiff and I had to push hard to get it to turn fully. I told myself it was just old hardware. I lit the stove and spent the evening cooking and unpacking. Outside, the forest settled into darkness early. The silence felt thick, like it pressed against the walls. That first night passed without anything clearly wrong, but I didn't sleep well. The cabin made noises as it cooled, small pops and creaks that echoed in the quiet. Every sound felt close. I woke several times thinking I heard something outside, but each time it faded before I could focus on it. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the clearing covered in frost. My breath fogged the air. I walked around the cabin, more out of curiosity than concern. That's when I noticed the tracks. Boot prints pressed deep into the frozen ground near the back wall. They didn't lead up to the door. They circled the cabin, unevenly spaced, like someone had been pacing. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to convince myself they were old. But the frost inside the prints had cracked differently than the surrounding ground. They were recent. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I kept looking toward the trees, half expecting to see movement. Nothing appeared. The forest stayed still. Too still. No birds, no wind, no distant sounds of traffic. By late afternoon, I noticed one of the window latches inside the cabin was loose. I didn't remember it being that way. I tightened it and tried to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. That night, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped directly outside the door. I froze in place, barely breathing. The steps shifted, weight pressing down, then easing off. Whoever it was didn't knock or try the handle. They just stood there for a while, then walked away. The sound of their boots faded into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, I found new tracks leading from the porch toward the forest. They were deeper than the ones from before, as if the person had been standing still for a long time. I considered leaving then, but pride and stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was just someone passing through. That afternoon, I went for a short walk, staying close to the cabin. I found something that made my chest tighten. A piece of orange survey tape tied to a branch about shoulder height, maybe 30 yards from the clearing. It was faded but not old. Someone had marked the area recently. I didn't know why, and that scared me more than the footprints. When I returned to the cabin, the door was unlocked. Nothing inside was destroyed. Nothing obvious was missing. But things were not where I left them. My backpack sat on the chair instead of the floor. One of the drawers was open. The bedspread was folded back, as if someone had checked underneath it. The air felt disturbed, like the space no longer belonged to me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they moved around the cabin. I heard them pause near each window. I heard something brush against the siding. At one point, something leaned against the wall hard enough to make it creak. I stayed completely still, holding my breath until my chest hurt. Hours passed. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I didn't move until daylight. In the morning, I found more signs. A handprint smeared with dirt on the side of the cabin. The woodpile shifted, logs stacked differently than before. A long scrape in the dirt leading away from the porch, as if something heavy had been dragged. I packed everything quickly. I didn't bother cleaning. I didn't check the trail again. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded my car, I felt watched. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling was strong enough to make my skin crawl. The drive out felt endless. I didn't relax until I reached the paved road. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. A week later, I received a message from the rental service. The cabin was being removed from listings. A maintenance worker had found signs of long-term squatting nearby. Makeshift shelters deeper in the forest. Food wrappers. Tools. The cabin apparently had been used for storage more than once. The lock on the door had been modified years earlier and never fixed. I understood then why no one had confronted me directly. I wasn't meant to stay. I was meant to leave on my own. I still think about that place sometimes. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Whoever was out there knew the land, knew the cabin, knew how to move without being noticed. They didn't need to threaten me or rush me. They just needed to remind me that I was alone, and that I didn't belong there. I listen to those instincts now. When something feels wrong, I leave. I don't wait for proof anymore. I rented the cabin because it was listed as maintenance-only access, which I took to mean privacy. It was deep in a managed forest, not wilderness exactly, but far enough that normal people didn't pass through unless they had a reason. The listing said the cabin was used in summer by trail workers and left empty the rest of the year. Late fall was the cheapest window, and that's when I went. The drive-in felt longer than it should have. The forest road narrowed after the last sign, and the gravel gave way to packed dirt with deep grooves that pulled the car slightly left and right. There were no fresh tire tracks, just old impressions hardened by cold nights. Trees leaned inward, blocking the sky. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon and already dim. The cabin sat in a shallow clearing, backed by dense trees on three sides. The fourth side faced a slope that dropped down toward a dry creek bed. It was a solid structure, thick logs, metal roof, no porch. Just a door and two small windows, both high enough that you couldn't easily look in from outside. It looked practical, not welcoming. Inside, everything was stripped down. A single room with a wood stove, a metal table bolted to the floor, two chairs, and a narrow bunk bed. There were shelves along one wall holding basic supplies left behind for workers. A broom, empty fuel cans, a coil of rope, a toolbox locked with a small padlock. The air smelled like cold metal and old ash. Nothing personal, nothing soft. I locked the door and noticed there were two locks. One deadbolt and one sliding bar mounted higher up, out of habit reach. That caught my attention. It wasn't decorative. Someone had installed it deliberately. The first night passed quietly. The forest made its normal sounds. Wind through branches, something small moving in the leaves. I slept light but uninterrupted. In the morning, I noticed frost on the inside edges of the windows, thick enough to blur the view. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside to stretch. That's when I saw the footprints. They came from the tree-line behind the cabin and stopped about 10 feet from the wall. Boot prints, large, deep at the heel. They didn't go anywhere else. No path leading in, no path leading away. Just there, as if someone had stood watching the cabin and then stepped backward into the same prints to leave no trail. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them. They were fresh. Frost hadn't touched them yet. I told myself it was a worker checking the site. That made sense. This was managed land. People had reasons to be here. I tried to let it go. Later that day, I walked down toward the creek bed. I found old signs of use. Flattened grass where tents had once been pitched. Charcoal buried under dirt. A rusted cooking pan half hidden under leaves. This place had history, but not the kind that shows up in listings. When I returned to the cabin, something felt off immediately. The door was locked, but the sliding bar was pushed slightly to the side, not fully seated. I knew I had set it properly. I remembered the pressure it took to slide into place. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, but the chair closest to the door had been moved a few inches. Not enough to notice casually. Enough that I noticed because I had memorized the space already. That night, I stayed awake longer. I kept the fire low and the lights off. The darkness outside the windows felt thick, like a wall. Around midnight, I heard something metal scrape softly against wood. It came from the outside wall near the tool shelf. I didn't move. I didn't reach for anything. I just listened. The sound stopped. Then footsteps moved slowly away. Not rushed. Not heavy. Someone who knew the ground well. In the morning, I checked the outside wall. There was a fresh mark on one of the logs, thin and vertical, like the edge of a tool had been pressed there. Not swung, just tested. That was when I noticed the toolbox lock was different. The padlock had scratches around the keyhole that weren't there before. Someone had tried to open it quietly and failed. I considered leaving then. I should have. But weather had moved in overnight. Clouds hung low, and the air felt heavy and still. I checked the road with binoculars from the slope. Snow had started settling in the shaded areas. Leaving later would be harder, not easier. That afternoon, I stayed inside. I read, cleaned. I kept my eyes on the door. Late in the day, I heard something behind the cabin again. Slow movement, a pause, then another step, always measured. I didn't hear footsteps circle this time, just presence. That night, the sounds came closer. I heard breathing outside the wall. Not exaggerated, just steady, close enough that it blended with the wind until I realized it wasn't wind at all. Stayed there for a long time. Whoever it was didn't touch the door, didn't test the locks. They already knew them. Eventually, the breathing stopped. Footsteps moved toward the creek bed. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found a new trail in the frost. A single line where something long had been dragged from the trees to the back of the cabin and then pulled away again. Whatever it was, it had weight. The drag marks were deep. I packed my things immediately. As I carried my bag to the car, I noticed something I hadn't before. A second structure, barely visible uphill through the trees. Not a cabin, just a lean-to built from branches and tarp, blended into the forest so well it looked like debris until you focused on it. It faced my cabin directly. Someone had been watching the place long before I arrived. I loaded the car as fast as I could. When I turned the key, the engine struggled in the cold before catching. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't look toward the trees. The road out was slow and tense. Halfway back to the main forest road, I passed fresh tracks crossing the road behind me. Boot prints, one set, pointing toward the cabin. Weeks later, after I was home and calm enough to look into it, I found an old maintenance report buried online. That cabin had been unofficially used by a former seasonal worker years ago. Someone who never left the area after the contract ended. Someone who stayed off records, off maps, living out of sight. The cabin wasn't abandoned to them. It was theirs. I understood then why nothing had been damaged. Why nothing was stolen. I wasn't being threatened. I was being evaluated. Given time to leave on my own. I don't think about that place because of fear anymore. I think about how deliberate everything was. How controlled. How patient. Some places aren't empty just because no one is supposed to be there. And some people don't need to scare you loudly to make sure you don't come back. I went to the cabin because it was the only place I could afford that month and because it was far enough away that no one would bother me. I had just switched jobs, my sleep schedule was ruined, and my apartment felt too loud even when it was quiet. I didn't want a vacation. I wanted to disappear for a few days and reset. The listing said the cabin was used by forestry contractors during the summer and empty the rest of the year. It mentioned rough access, no signal, and limited heat. None of that bothered me. The road leading to the cabin peeled off from a two-lane highway and quickly turned into packed dirt. There were no signs after the first mile, just trees and old tire grooves hardened by time. The farther I drove, the more abandoned it felt. Fallen branches littered the road. Moss crept over old logging markers. I didn't see another vehicle the entire way. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was already turning dull gray, the kind that promises an early night. The cabin was small and plain. Dark wood, no porch, one door, two narrow windows set high on the walls. It looked more like a storage building than a place meant for people to relax. There were no footprints around it, just leaves and dirt pressed flat in old patterns. A stack of firewood sat against the side, neatly arranged but weathered, like it had been there a long time. Inside, the cabin was colder than I expected. The air smelled stale, like dust and old smoke that had soaked into the walls. The layout was simple. One room, a metal table bolted to the floor, two chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a wood stove near the center. There was a small storage closet with shelves but no door, just an open frame. Everything felt stripped down and functional. No decorations, no personal items, nothing that made the space feel lived in. I locked the door and noticed there were two locks, a standard deadbolt and a thick sliding bar mounted higher up. The bar had scratches around it like it had been used often. That detail stuck with me, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I got the fire going and unpacked slowly. Outside, the forest grew quiet as the light faded. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. That night I slept lightly. Every small sound felt louder than it should have. The stove popped as it cooled. The walls creaked. I woke several times, but nothing happened. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately felt uneasy. The ground near the cabin was soft from recent rain, and there were boot prints near the edge of the clearing. Large prints, deep. They didn't circle the cabin or lead up to the door. They stopped about 10 feet away, facing the building. Whoever made them had stood there for a while. I tried to match them to my boots. They didn't line up. The tread was different. The size was wrong. I told myself someone had checked the cabin before I arrived. A worker, a ranger, anyone with a reason to be there. I forced myself to believe that and spent the day hiking short distances nearby. I found old signs of use scattered through the trees. Flattened ground where something heavy had sat for a long time. Rusted nails in tree trunks. Bits of wire half buried in dirt. This place had been used regularly at some point, just not recently. When I came back in the afternoon, I noticed the door didn't open the way I remembered. It resisted slightly, like something had shifted. Inside, nothing looked wrong at first glance. But the chair closest to the table was angled differently. Only a few inches, but enough that it caught my eye. I was certain I hadn't left it that way. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I kept the fire low and the lights off. I wanted to hear everything. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. Slow steps through leaves. Careful, deliberate, not rushed. The steps stopped near the sidewall. I stayed still, barely breathing. Something brushed against the cabin. A soft scraping sound, like fabric or a sleeve dragging along wood. Then nothing. The steps moved away, not toward the door, not toward the road, but deeper into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I found more tracks. Fresh ones. They circled the cabin once and stopped beneath the window near the bed. The ground there was pressed flat, as if someone had stood there for a long time. I checked the window. The latch was loose. I was sure it had been tight before. I packed a bag with essentials and set it by the door. I told myself I would leave if anything else happened. The weather report I had checked before losing service mentioned rain later in the week. Leaving sooner would be easier. That afternoon, I noticed something else. One of my items had been moved. A flashlight I kept on the table was now on the shelf near the closet. I hadn't touched it. I searched the cabin carefully. Nothing else was missing. Nothing else was damaged. The door was still locked. That realization hit harder than the tracks. Someone had been inside without forcing their way in. That night, the sounds returned. Footsteps closer this time, slower. They moved around the cabin, stopping near each window. I heard breathing outside the wall, steady and close. At one point, something leaned against the door. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to make the wood creak. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, my entire body tense. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I focused on staying quiet, staying invisible. Eventually, the pressure eased. The steps moved away. Morning came gray and heavy. I stepped outside and found the ground disturbed near the back of the cabin. A shallow trench in the dirt, like something long and heavy had been dragged there. It led toward the trees and disappeared among the leaves. That was when I noticed something uphill from the cabin, a shape that didn't belong. At first, it looked like a pile of branches. When I focused, I realized it was a structure. A low shelter made of sticks, tarp, and leaves, blended carefully into the forest. It faced the cabin directly. Someone had been living there, watching. I didn't hesitate anymore. I loaded my car as fast as I could. I didn't clean. I didn't organize. I kept my eyes on the trees the entire time. The forest felt close, like it was leaning inward. The drive out was tense and silent. Halfway down the road, I saw fresh boot prints crossing the dirt, heading toward the cabin. One set, recent. Weeks later, after I had settled back into normal life, I looked into the area. I found a local report buried online about illegal long-term camps discovered in that section of forest. People living off-grid, using seasonal cabins when they were empty, avoiding contact, protecting what they considered theirs. Nothing supernatural had happened to me. No warnings, no threats, just quiet pressure and patience. I understood then why nothing had been taken, why nothing had been broken. I wasn't being robbed. I was being pushed out. I don't think about that cabin because of fear alone. I think about how controlled everything was, how someone knew the land well enough to stay hidden and let time do the work. Some places aren't meant to be rented, and some people don't need to speak to make their intentions clear.